Good morning, everybody. Good morning. That's much better. Let me share with you how blessed we are today to have this event. And I would be remiss in not thanking Dr. Ken Hallman, who has put this event together. So, Dr. Hallman, would you join me in a round of applause for him? There are three of our university trustees present this morning, and I want to thank them specifically for their attendance. Chairman Hatcher is here. Sam, would you please rise? Joined by Dr. Mike Spalding, who is the chairman of the Academic Affairs Committee, and Dr. Andre Churchwell, who's the vice chancellor of Vanderbilt University. Would you join me in thanking them? You know, remembering is important. And I want to say that one more time. Remembering is important. And sometimes we remember really happy events like birthdays or like anniversaries or like children being born. And then we also remember some unhappy and unpleasant events. And today, we're going to think through and learn about an unhappy event. An event that was about racism, about cruelty, about inhumanity. And why do we remember those kinds of things? Well, we remember them because, number one, if we don't remember them and we forget, we sometimes repeat those kinds of things. We remember them because we learn from mistakes. And we remember them because it's important that we do not lose our humanity as a part of the process. So thank you for being here, and thank you for learning, and thank you for being people who have minds and spirits to learn. And I want to start our program by introducing our first speaker, the Most Reverend Michael J. Spalding. Dr. Spalding is the 12th bishop of the Diocese of Nashville of the Roman Catholic Church. He was installed as bishop in 2017. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1991. He is a man of letters and learning. He has a bachelor's degree in history, a second degree in sacred theology, a third degree in canon law. He serves 38 counties of the state of Tennessee and supervises 75 priests and 70 permanent deacons. He has been on this campus several times before, and each time that he's here, our institution is better for his presence. Please join me in welcoming Bishop Spalding.
When I go out to the various parishes and groups within the Diocese of Nashville, and pretty much, as just mentioned, the diocese is the 38 middle counties. That's my area that I have to help minister and shepherd. But the line I use so many times is St. Peter's at the Transfiguration. It is good that we are here. It's good that we are here. It's good to call to mind, even though it may be painful, some history of how we as brothers and sisters in Christ, as sons and daughters of God, as temples of the Holy Spirit, have not lived in that way. And we've been racist, and we've caused harm to others. And so on a day in which we do remember all that was the Holocaust, we also commit ourselves once again, never again, never again, never again. The history, I was asked to speak a little bit about the history of the Catholic Church around the Holocaust, and it's convoluted to say the least. And why we need to all be good historians, because we don't want that ever to happen again. But in the midst of a convoluted, difficult situation, there were great things that happened. Various bishops and various leaders within our church, women and men alike, in monasteries, in convents, within the Vatican, they all had a whole system. I'll give you a movie, The Scarlet and the Black. I don't know if you've ever watched that movie. It'll help contextualize what you're going to hear from me today. It's on YouTube. It's free, okay? The Scarlet and the Black. And in it, you see how various priests, sisters, religious sisters, how various laity all worked within Rome and throughout Italy in the time of trying to help protect the Jews, and also American and other military that were fighting the Nazis at that time. We need to know this history. We need to understand and appreciate what happened then. One part of the history as well, and this is not within the Catholic Church, but it was with General Eisenhower. You know, Eisenhower, when they came to the camps, he had the military bring through the various townspeople because he never wanted them to say, this didn't happen. This is all made up. No, painfully and very painfully, it did. Could people have done more? Probably. Did people do a lot? Yes, they did. Even in the midst of that suffering and sorrow, they gave what they could and helped where they were in that part of Europe. Also, a good person to look up as well is John the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd. He was only Pope for 5 years. At that time in his history, he was in Bulgaria as an ambassador. And John was trying to help as many people as he could. And so he was using all these documents to give European citizenship, or even, I think he had to ask God for forgiveness, but he gave these things that even had some of the Jews say, no, they work for the Vatican, or they were part of the church in some form or fashion. And he was able to help them get to Switzerland, a neutral country. These stories are a part of our history. And what you're going to hear after my little presentation and little talk is another affirmation of how we need to remember and understand who we are and what we can never be. Who we are and what we can never be. Right now, there's a struggle in Israel. It's a painful one. And in that struggle, we in some ways have forgotten who we are. In that land of Abraham, in one of our great prayers in our church is we call out to Abraham, our Father in faith. And we as Christians, we must understand he, in so many ways, is part of the covenant. It came through Christ and is down to us. And as our Father in faith, we understand He's also the father of the Jewish people, father of the Muslim people. And we can't lose who we are as his children. And we must work together. We must work together, always seeing each other as a child of God. So let us continue to pray for peace. Let us remember our history that sometimes has been fraught with difficulties, and know your history. You heard one of my degrees was history. I love it. I still today love learning more and more about history. And even if it's difficult history, to say we can do better. We must do better. And I can never forget. And I love the variety of people that are sitting right before me this moment. Look around the room. I'm going to finish with not so much a Holocaust point, but a point that I'm working, and I know everybody in the church, whatever church your church is these days. The church is diverse. Roman Catholic Church right now is Anglo, it's Hispanic, it's Vietnamese, it's Filipino, it's Korean, it's African American, and African. It's Haitian. You name the group, that's who we are these days. And my job as bishop is this: look around, see the diversity, and see it as gift. And see it as gift. And how we come together in Christ. May our eyes and our ears be open to the presentation we're about to hear, and may we be committed evermore to seeing ourselves as the sons and daughters of Abraham. God bless you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bishop Spalding. I'm not sure what's going on with this microphone, and I hope it doesn't happen again, but does it always happen for you when you finish a speech that the microphone does that?
I have microphone gremlins that follow me.
It's my privilege today to introduce our keynote speaker, and this gentleman is one who is truly a bit of a Renaissance man. I just met him a little while ago. He and his lovely wife, Kaki, are here with us from Charlottesville, Virginia. Dr. George Beller is the gentleman whom I need to introduce, and I want to tell you just a little bit about his many professional accolades and accomplishments. He has degrees from both Dartmouth University, where he did his undergraduate, and the University of Virginia Medical School. He trained in cardiology at Harvard Medical School and at Mass General Hospital. He served on the faculty at Harvard Medical School for 3 years. Then he went to the UVA Medical School faculty, where he was chief of cardiology, chief of the cardiovascular division of the Department of Medicine for 28 years. He has extensive research, especially in nuclear cardiology. He's published more than 500 papers, medical reviews, book chapters. He served on 17 editorial boards and was editor-in-chief of the Journal of Nuclear Cardiology for 10 years. Parenthetically, I'm told that there was an elective class when he was an undergraduate or a medical school student at UVA. It was an elective class in the EKG technology, which we all take for granted today. So he's been around this field for quite some time. If time permitted, I could spend his entire 30 minutes or 40 minutes, the next 30 minutes at least, introducing him and still not touch on many of his accomplishments and honors and awards. But I do want you to know two things before I turn the podium over to him. One, he's a lover and supporter of the arts and also an accomplished photographer. And secondly, he's a huge Beatles fan. Any Beatles fans out there? You young folks probably don't even know about the Beatles, but they were all the rage when I was coming up. I love the Beatles, and he too is a Beatles fan. We're here today, however, not to hear a lecture on nuclear cardiology, nor a lecture on photography, nor on the Beatles, any one of which I'm sure he could do extemporaneously. But rather today we're here to hear from him a remarkable story about his family as it relates to our raison d'etre, which Dr. McKee described. Our raison d'etre today, our reason for being, is to remember an important part of our history which should not be forgotten. So with that, will you please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. George Beller.
Good morning again. President Stum, Provost McKee, Bishop Spalding, Professor Hallman, faculty, students, and guests. I am honored to be your speaker this morning, observing International Holocaust Memorial Day. I also want to thank my medical school classmate, Dr. Michael Spalding, for recommending me as your speaker. During the next 40 minutes, I will share with you the harrowing saga of my family's escape from the Nazi onslaught during World War II. The story is just one among thousands that have been told by survivors of the Holocaust. The story actually begins in a shtetl, which is the Yiddish word for a town or village. Until the early 20th century, my grandparents and their ancestors lived in shtetls in southeastern Poland. The Bellers came from the village of Grodzisko, which was 95% Jewish, speaking Yiddish as the everyday language. My grandfather, Simon Beller, and his family left Poland, left this village in 1915 for Vienna when my father was just 4 years old, and he was the youngest of 4 siblings. During World War II, 1,000 years of Jewish life in Grodzisko were erased by the Nazis. 3 million Polish Jews perished in Poland, including 111 members of the Beller family still living in Grodzisko. We have a good idea what life was like in the village of Grodzisko from paintings created by my great uncle, Elex Beller, the book cover shown on the left. He had a good idea what life was like. Elex left the village with his family in 1928 to live in France. On the right is a painting he made of my great-great-grandfather, Aaron Yehuda Beller, the patriarch of the family. He is shown donning a prayer shawl, reading from a Hebrew text. On the left side of this slide is a winter scene of the village, with some of its inhabitants in the foreground. On the right is a depiction of a typical family home. 95% of the inhabitants of Grodzisko were Jewish. They were poor and led a simple life. Shown on the left is a joyful marriage celebration with my great-great-grandfather engaged in the scarf dance with the bride. Then, as depicted on the right, in 1939, the Nazis entered Grodzisko, burning the village and ultimately killing 150 Jews in all. Only about 24 Jews from the village escaped, some being killed later by the Nazis in other countries. Meanwhile, my father's family had been living a wonderful life in Vienna since 1915 when they left Poland. My grandfather, Simon Beller, became successful and affluent in the banking and real estate businesses. The family was content. They considered themselves model assimilated citizens, supportive of Viennese culture, concert halls, opera, theater, and art exhibits. Simon valued education, and his children thrived. They lived in the Palais Dumba on the Ringstrasse, the most prestigious avenue in Vienna. My father, Izzy Beller, attended the University of Vienna, after which he was co-owner with his brother Aaron, my uncle, of a factory that manufactured bottle caps from gelatins. This slide shows the route of the Ringstrasse in pink in Vienna. It circles around the oldest parts of Vienna and is praised for its beauty and charm. Our family's home was in a section overlooking a park. This slide shows the building in which the family lived as it looked in the 1930s and as it looked today. My grandfather's office was on the first floor above the shops. The living quarters were on the next 3 floors. This slide shows photographs of the Beller family in Vienna. On the left, my grandmother Rosa is shown with her 4 children. My father is standing on a chair above his brother Aaron. His 2 sisters, Lada and Jana, are standing on the right of my grandmother. In the photo on the right, taken some years later, my father is lying down next to his sister, Jana. I show this next slide to illustrate how different my grandfather and father looked in their Viennese life as contrasted with their previous life in Grodzisko, Poland. As I mentioned, they were totally assimilated into Viennese society. On the far right of the slide, my father is shown on skis during a vacation in the Alps. No matter how assimilated Jews felt they were in Vienna, they could not ignore the growing anti-Semitism. This slide shows a quote from a book, The Hare with Amber Eyes, by Edmund Duval, pertaining to anti-Semitism in Vienna in the 1930s. Quote, "The Jews' insatiability was the common theme. They simply did not know their limits. Anti-Semitism was part of common day-to-day life. The flavor of Viennese anti-Semitism was different from Parisian anti-Semitism. In both cases, it happened both overtly and covertly. But in Vienna, you could expect to have your hat knocked off your head on the Ringstrasse for just looking Jewish, be abused as a dirty Jew for opening a window in a train carriage, be snubbed at a meeting of a charity committee, and have your lectures at the university disrupted by cries of Jews out until every Jewish student had picked up his books and left. Then came the annexation of Austria by Germany, referred to as the Anschluss. The real terror for the Viennese Jewish population began on March 11, 1938, when the German army marched into and annexed Austria. The Austrians welcomed the Nazis with no resistance. Immediately on that day, swastikas on armbands appeared in the streets. The following day, Jews began to be persecuted and assets confiscated by the Nazis. Elderly Jews, including my grandmother Rosa, were ordered to wash the streets on their hands and knees. Nazis urinated on their heads as they knelt down. Nazis took over the Beller house. The furniture and art were auctioned, with proceeds going to the Nazis. The left side of this slide is a map depicting the invasion of Austria, which is shown in deep red, by the German army. The right side shows the Austrian citizens welcoming the Nazis by waving Nazi flags and giving the Heil Hitler salute. Adolf Hitler, shown on the left in a limousine, arrived in Vienna on the evening of March 13, 1938. The next day, he was received with open arms, as shown on the left. That day, Hitler announced that Austria was now part of the Third Reich. On the right, schoolgirls are waving Nazi flags, cheering Hitler's motorcade. This is what my family must have seen looking out of the windows that day in sheer horror. This slide shows Jews scrubbing a street in Vienna. One day, a Nazi soldier told my grandmother Rosa to clean the street in front of him. My father shouted, "Over my dead body." The officer calmly replied, "That can be arranged." My grandmother then got on her hands and knees and scrubbed the street. My father, shown on the left in this picture, seemed not to be in a hurry to leave Vienna. The slide shows him with two friends at the racetrack soon after the German invasion. It's small, but note the swastika sign on the viewing stand above the woman's head. On the day of the Anschluss, some of the Beller family members were outside of Austria and Europe. By early May 1938, my father knew they had to leave Vienna. Their bottle cap factory, Elastit, had been confiscated, and its foreman made the new owner. With the help of a business contact, my father and grandmother secured 2 Yugoslavian transit visas. His brother stayed behind and left a month later. My father and grandmother got on a train headed to Yugoslavia, but were ordered off the train by the Nazis at the Austrian-Italian border. Essentially, it was Trieste, which part of the city is in Italy, part in what was Yugoslavia then. But fortunately, they were allowed to cross the border, though they had nothing but their luggage. This is my father's escape route. After crossing the border into now what is called Slovenia, which was part of Yugoslavia at that time, my father and his mother, my grandmother, traveled to Zurich to get false papers from a friend. Then went to Paris, where my father stayed for a period of time. And then he joined the rest of the family in Antwerp, Belgium. Most of the Beller family settled in Antwerp after escaping from Vienna. Lotta, my father's oldest sister, and her family became residents of London. They actually left in 1938 to go directly to London. His other sister, Jana, was married in Vienna in 1932. They had already moved to Antwerp in 1937 with one daughter. In Antwerp, my father met Joanna Gross, a Belgian citizen, and they fell in love. Her father, Isaac Gross, was in the diamond production business. His firm imported rough diamonds from the mines in South Africa, and from them produced cut diamonds for jewelry. My parents were married March 31st, 1940. 750 guests attended their wedding and reception in the afternoon, with 250 of them staying for a formal dinner in the evening. Here, this slide shows photographs of my mother and her family. In the left photo, my mother is in the center, surrounded by her parents and 2 brothers. On the right is an earlier photo of my mother with her brothers. She was also having a wonderful life, fully assimilated into the Belgian culture way of life. Here are some photos taken at my parents' wedding. The photo on the right shows my mother with her father, my grandfather, preparing to enter a vehicle and take them to the wedding venue. Here is my parents' wedding dinner. Note how happy the family looks in the background of the photo on the right. You can see my mother in her wedding gown, my father next to him smiling. The Germans invaded Belgium 5 weeks after this wedding. As a result, the Jews in these photos escaped from Antwerp, were arrested and deported to France, or were killed by the Nazis in concentration camps. On May 10th, 1940, 5 weeks after their wedding, my parents were awakened at 5 a.m. by German planes flying overhead. The maid sent by my mother's parents came a few hours later with a taxi and helped them hastily pack 2 suitcases. My father could not accompany my mother and her family since he didn't have a Belgian passport. He returned to his family, his father, his brothers, grandmother, his mother, to attempt to leave with them across the French border. My mother and her family took a taxi close to the French border and walked the rest of the way. They crossed into France, took the train to Paris, and then on to Biarritz, near the Spanish border. My father, however, and his brother Aaron and my grandfather Simon were arrested in Belgium as enemy aliens. They were told to gather their personal effects and report to a military base outside of Antwerp. They quickly crammed their pockets with diamonds and other valuables before arriving at the base. From the base, they were sent with 3,000 other male Jews to Saint Cyprien, an internment camp in southern France. When they arrived, all their valuables were confiscated. The camp near the Mediterranean formerly housed fleeing Spanish Republicans during the Spanish Civil War. Saint Cyprien was comprised of 13 areas with ramshackle barracks that had neither beds nor floors. They had to sleep on the sand. The huts where they slept were dirty and uncommonly hot and built right over the sand with no floors. Food was scarce. Prisoners were given rotten peaches or tomatoes in hot water. My father never ate tomatoes after that experience. And I understand that my uncle, Aaron, never ate peaches the rest of his life. Mice and rats devoured the food. Flies and mosquitoes abounded. A dysentery epidemic affected everyone in the camp. Short of medicines, doctors could not treat the prisoners. The camp was completely sealed and surrounded by barbed wire. This slide shows the location of the Saint Cyprien camp, which was really a French internment camp, not a German, and it was on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. On the right is a photo of prisoners interned at Saint Cyprien with one of the ramshackle huts behind the group. Felix Nussbaum was a German artist who was living in Antwerp at the time of the German invasion of Belgium. He was also sent to Saint Cyprien. He eventually escaped and returned to Antwerp, where he painted scenes of the camp as he recalled them. On the left is a self-portrait of Nussbaum dressed as a prisoner. Now you have to look carefully, you may not see it in the back of the room, but shown in the background are 2 huts that house prisoners, and a man using a barrel as a latrine next to an emaciated man wearing only white underpants. The barbed wire fence is shown in the back of the huts. On the right is another self-portrait. Nussbaum's hat is pushed back slightly to reveal the lines of a frown of anger. The portrait, with Nussbaum's clenched fist in front of the barbed wire fence, expresses what I think is profound rage. This is an extraordinary slide. This painting shows a group of Jewish prisoners in the camp praying in front of a hut. Now, according to the story that we heard, was that 3 pious Jews from Antwerp actually went to Saint Cyprien and allowed themselves to be arrested near the camp in order to bring the Torah scroll and prayer shawls for fellow Jews. Escape from Saint Cyprien. My father, his brother, and my grandfather escaped from Saint Cyprien by bribing the commandant. And how this was accomplished is a little unclear in our history. But the most plausible explanation was my father's sister, who was living in London, were able to get money to the camp in France to give to the commandant as a bribe. After getting out of the camp, they made their way to Marseille, where my grandfather was put in contact with a Catholic priest who operated as a passeur. Now, passeur is a French word for smuggler. So a passeur in World War II was someone who smuggled people out of Nazi-occupied France. From Marseille, with the Catholic priest, they traveled to the Spanish border by hiding in monasteries and churches. The priest then guided them over the Pyrenees Mountains, walking at night, much of it in snow. After crossing the border into Spain, they were aided by a succession of local Spanish helpers. They finally made it to Madrid and then entered Portugal. The blue and red lines on this slide represent the escape routes over the Pyrenees taken by the passeurs with groups of refugees. My father, grandfather, and brother would have taken the blue route from Marseille, shown on the extreme right. As I will describe later, my mother and her family took the escape route in red along the Atlantic on the left side of the map. It's remarkable that this photo on the left was found. It shows actual refugees, Jewish refugees with walking sticks in deep snow on one of the passes over the mountain range. Today, as shown on the right, tourists can now take what is known as the Freedom Trail. It's a marked walk that commemorates one of the secret escape routes over the Central Pyrenees into northern Spain. My wife and I have been talking about taking our children, our grandchildren, over that pass in remembrance of the escape of my father's grandfather and brother. I'd now like to briefly discuss how the Catholic Church aided Jews in France during World War II. Jews in France were aided in their escape to Spain through efforts of Catholic bishops, priests, seminarians, religious, and lay Catholics. Secret actions to help the Jews occurred in church sanctuaries, behind convent and monastery walls, and with church approval. Covert actions, as in the case of the Bellers, included, quote, hiding refugees, and on occasion smuggling Jews out of the country. These covert undertakings required formal church involvement, such as issuing baptismal certificates, work permits, enrollment documents, identity cards, and travel authorization. Pope Pius XII was the Pope during World War II. How did he act during the Holocaust? Pope Pius XII remained silent publicly about the Jews being killed by the Nazis in death camps. A letter found among the private papers of Pope Pius XII suggests that the Holy See was told in 1942 that up to 6,000 people, above all Poles and Jews, were being killed in furnaces every day at Belzec, a Nazi death camp in Poland. Some scholars say Pius did not want to confront or offend Hitler because he feared communism, believed the Axis powers would win the war, and wanted to avoid alienating millions of German and Nazi sympathizing Catholics. Other historians insist that Pius XII remained silent publicly because he was surreptitiously arranging for, or at least allowing, local Catholics to aid and save Jews from the Nazis. And he also feared the Nazis might come after Catholics. So while all this was happening, what happened to my grandmother, Rosa? Well, my grandfather, father, and uncle were in Saint Cyprien. My grandmother, Rosabella, remained in Belgium after my grandfather, father, and brother were sent to Saint Cyprien. She journeyed with a friend to Dunkirk by train and then walked a long distance to reach the beach. She joined thousands of French and British soldiers waiting to be ferried out to larger ships by a flotilla of hundreds of smaller vessels called into service by Britain. A total of 338,000 soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk on these small boats. Rosa got on a small boat, incredibly, with a group of soldiers to ferry to a British destroyer, which took them to Southampton, England. In May 1940, Germany advanced into France, trapping Allied troops on the beaches of Dunkirk. Under air and ground cover from British and French forces, troops were slowly and methodically evacuated from the beach using every serviceable naval and civilian vessel that could be found. Many of you probably saw the 2017 movie of this evacuation, directed by Christopher Nolan, who also, by the way, directed the recent film Oppenheimer. This slide shows soldiers being evacuated from the beach at Dunkirk in small boats and being ferried to larger ships. Amazingly, my grandmother Rosa could not speak English, was able to get on one of these boats to escape to England with these soldiers. On her arrival in Southampton as a refugee, my grandmother Rosa was labeled an enemy alien since she had an Austrian passport and spoke German. After her arrival in London, she was sent to a Holloway prison, where she was among 3,600 women sent there en route to the Isle of Man. She was imprisoned on the Isle of Man for a year, unable to tell anyone she had a daughter, Lotta, living in London. Eventually, a rabbi who spoke German met with Rosa and understood she had a daughter in London. He found Lotta, who was eventually able to get her mother released. Rosa finally joined my grandfather 5 years later, after the war in New York in 1945. On the left of the slide is shown Holloway Prison as it appeared in 1940. It is where my grandmother was placed right after her arrival in England. On the right, a woman internee sewing garments on the Isle of Man when my grandmother was interned for a year. Now, what about my mother's family? Well, my father was imprisoned at Saint Cyprien, and my grandmother was escaping to England. What happened to my mother and her parents and brother, shown in this photo at my parents' wedding? From Antwerp, my mother and her parents and brother went to Biarritz, where they lived in a hotel. The German army was advancing along the Atlantic coast to Bordeaux towards Biarritz and the Spanish border. Alarmed, my mother, who was then almost 3 months pregnant with me, convinced her father that they had to leave immediately. Aristide de Souza Mendes, a devout Catholic, and the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux issued them visas to Portugal in a town of Bayonne. They packed 2 suitcases and checked into a hotel in Hendaye, a French town at the Spanish border. This slide shows the distance from Biarritz to Bayonne, where my parents were staying, first after leaving Antwerp, and then to Bayonne, where they secured their visas to Portugal. This map shows the route in the upper right-hand corner from Biarritz, where they had been staying, to the town of Hendaye, where my mother and her family crossed the border into Spain. On this slide is a quote from my mother's memoir, which she gave us in 1997. It describes what her mother, my other grandmother, did the night before they crossed the border into Spain en route to Portugal. She said, "On my return to Hendaye Hotel, my mother took the diamonds hidden in my father's money belt and mixed them with creams removed from the jars and put them back in the original Elizabeth Arden jars. She put the jewelry in balls of wool and stuck the 2 knitting needles in them herself. She hid gold coins and small bars of gold in socks. She then packed on top of our clothing a dozen enlarged photos of our wedding." This is in her words. "We entered the customs house, where an agent started examining one suitcase. He spent such a long time turning every page of the wedding photos, suspecting hidden money, that he finally gave up. Dejected, he did not even ask to open the other suitcase." This photo on the left shows the border crossing as it looked in June of 1940 in Hendaye. Although still in my mother's womb, I was also saved after my mother crossed the border at this location. On the right is a Spanish border guard checking the visas of refugees. I would not like to tell you the story of Aristide de Souza Mendez, the hero who saved 30,000 refugees, including 10,000 Jews, from the Nazis. This slide shows a photo of Souza Mendez and the Portuguese consulate on the right, where my mother and her family and thousands of other refugees got their Portuguese visas. This map shows the 3 locations where Souza Mendez issued visas to refugees as the Germans were descending down the coast of France. Although forbidden by President Salazar of Portugal, Souza Mendez issued visas in Bordeaux, Bayonne, and Hendaye. In June 1940, as shown on this slide, it was depicted, he threw open his doors and began to sign visas en masse, and once he started, he didn't stop. They lined up by the thousands, at his desk, out the door, down the stairs, and into the streets. On the night of June 19th, 1940, which is the day before my parents got the visas, German planes bombed Bordeaux. Panic-stricken, the crowds of refugees waiting for visas ran for Bayonne and Hendaye, towns closer to the Spanish border. Souza Mendez drove to Bayonne from Bordeaux on June 20th. He found 20,000 refugees, including my mother and her family, lining the streets, and another 5,000 encircling the consulate. Souza Mendez shouldered through the mob and entered the front door of the consulate. He ordered the Bayonne consul to start issuing visas immediately. 10,000 of the men, women, and children he saved were Jews who would have ended up in Nazi labor camps, death camps. My mother, pregnant with me, was one of those who were saved. Shown on this slide is my grandfather's passport on the left, and the precious visa to Portugal stamped June 20th, 1940, in Bayonne on the right. If not for Souza Mendez, I would not likely be here today. In his own words, taken from articles and magazines and the foundation that he was established in his honor, he said, "I'm going to issue visas to anyone who asks for it. Even if I am discharged, I can only act as a Christian, as my conscience tells me. It was indeed my objective to save all those persons whose affliction was beyond description. After being recalled to Lisbon, he stated at a disciplinary hearing, "I may have erred, but if so, I did it unintentionally, having followed the voice of my conscience, which, despite the nervous breakdown I am still experiencing due to the workload during which I spent weeks with practically no sleep, never failed to guide me in the fulfillment of my duties and full awareness of my responsibilities. When told of his punishment, he said, I would rather stand with God against man than with man against God." Sousa Mendez was dismissed from his diplomatic services for defying orders from President Salazar to stop granting visas. He was denied retirement and severance benefits and forbidden from earning a living. He had 15 children who were themselves blacklisted and prevented from attending university or finding meaningful work. His ancestral home was repossessed by the bank and eventually sold to cover debts. He died on April 3rd, 1954, in poverty and disgrace. Before his death, he asked his children to clear his name. Many years later, he was finally recognized by Portugal with an apology to his family and given a posthumous rank of ambassador. This is another quote from my mother's memoir about crossing the border. "We crossed the border on foot and then took a train to Portugal via Spain. We were assigned to Oporto, where other Belgian refugees joined us. Through my sister-in-law in New York, we found out my husband was in a French camp in Spain. In a tape, he describes all he went through, which is what I described before, going over the Pyrenees and so on. But finally, he made it to Oporto from Madrid, where he was reunited with my mother. For months, they did not know if they were either one were alive or where they were. She said, I was starting my 8th month of pregnancy, and we kept pressuring the American consul to give me a visa so that the baby could be born in America. My parents reunited by a miracle, settled into a hotel in Oporto, Portugal, waiting for visas to enter the United States and for passage on a ship to New York. Leo J. Callanan, born in Dorchester, Massachusetts, was the American consul in Oporto at that time. As you will hear, he was referred to as a friend of the Jews. This slide describes how Leo Callahan issued visas to Jews in Oporto. Refugees were told by a representative of the Jewish community how to get a visa. Quote, in order to get a visa to the U.S., you must prove you won't be a public charge. I will make an appointment for you to see the consul, Mr. Callanan. Before the meeting, we will hand you a sack of dollars. Wait your turn, and the consul will call you in. He will ask, how do you plan to support yourself in America? You will respond, well, you see, I have this sack of $10,000, and that is what we're going to plan to use in America. Then he will say, okay, and turn to his assistant and say, give them a visa. You will take the visa and leave. When you get outside, you will return the sack to us, and the next person will take the sack and go in to see the consul. As it turns out, it was my Uncle Aaron who gave these instructions to visa applicants before he left for the United States. Fortunately, my parents could prove they had enough money to start their lives in the United States, so they didn't need to be given the sack of dollars for a visa. My mother, who was 8 months pregnant, wanted her baby to be born in America. She pleaded with Consul Callanan, even crying in his presence, to be given a visa as soon as possible. He took a number from someone else in Lisbon and put it on top and gave it to her so she could reach New York on time for me to be born in the United States. My mother sailed from Lisbon to New York on the ship Excalibur and arrived in New York on November 21st, 1940, Thanksgiving Day. I was born in New York City on December 23rd, 1940. My mother's parents arrived in New York on the ship Serpa Pinto in January 1941. And my father, who could not be there because there was only one passage allowed on that ship, which my mother took, he arrived on another ship, Siboney, in January 1941. And this slide shows the two ships, the one on the left that my mother took and the one on the right that my father took. This slide shows immigrants arriving at Ellis Island in New York. I can just imagine the feelings of joy and relief that my family experienced as they finally set foot on American soil. I'm going to finish up now. This slide shows a photo some years later of our family gathering in New York. It is a miracle that everyone in this Beller family photo survived the Holocaust during the war. The family had not been together, like in this picture, for 7 years, from 1938 to 1945. And here is my father standing behind my grandfather in the middle. He escaped 3 times. First from Austria, then from Belgium, and then from France, with my grandfather sitting below and his brother to the second from the upper left. Here's my grandmother, who alone traveled to England and was in prison for a year. And there's in the upper right my mother, who was separated from my father and with her family and made it from Belgium to France to finally Portugal, the neutral country. And this slide shows the next generation at a family gathering. And because their parents survived, our family is now blessed with children and grandchildren thriving in the United States. So I'd like to leave you with a message in these next 2 slides. In total, 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered by the Nazi regime. Anti-Semitism, the hatred of prejudice against Jews, was a basic tenet of Nazi ideology. Believe it or not, today there are Holocaust deniers who argue that Nazi Germany was a victim of a conspiracy. They claim that atrocities never occurred and that the US and Great Britain concocted atrocity stories to cover up their own war crimes. Since 2016, there has been a worldwide rise in anti-Semitism and hate crimes.
You know, it's amazing to learn the story of people and to learn and to think about how blessed we are as Americans and how blessed we are that people like Dr. Beller will share his story with us. Would you join me again in another round of applause for him? And I'll leave you with one final thought. As you leave the room today, feel blessed, feel thankful, and feel the kind of spirit that Dr. Beller shared with us today. And I ask you, as you leave, to leave quietly in honor of Dr. Beller and his family. Thank you for being here.
International Holocaust Memorial Day 1 year ago. And he said, referring to Germany, "It is our duty as a nation and humans to keep the memory alive and make sure history does not repeat itself. Never forget, never again." This became a supreme priority of our education and of our foreign policy. Today, this means fighting against any kind of discrimination, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamism, and hate, which is again on the rise in our societies. This begins at the grassroots level of our societies, in education, in schools, and in local religious communities. Thank you for your attention.